All right. Well, welcome to Roland Emmerich, King of the Disaster Film? Question mark. Oops, one sec. So I pose this as a question, but what I'm going to go over, I actually think he is the best pound for pound disaster director we have ever had. All right. So he's one of those directors where you've seen his movies, you know his films, you may not know his name. I didn't even know what he looked like until a few years ago. But he's definitely made some of the more iconic films of the past 30 years. We think of 90s blockbusters, we think probably of two movies. We think of Jurassic Park, and then we think of Independence Day. Or if we're getting into 1999, we're going to talk about the beloved blockbuster The Mummy. There were two other blockbusters that came out that year that people didn't like. And no, I'm not listening to Phantom Menace apologists at this time, but we'll get into that in December. So he's directed Independence Day, he's directed Stargate, The Day After Tomorrow. These really big movies that we really became a part of the cultural consciousness. Independence Day, especially Stargate. We'll get into Day After Tomorrow and stuff like 2012. But also, really, they're throwbacks to an earlier time of cinema, which we'll get to in a moment. So you have a name like Emmerich. Not surprising, he is not a native citizen. He actually, oops, sorry, the keyboard on this has been getting kind of weird. All right. Grew up in Germany, so he was the son of a very wealthy father. His dad owned a company that made gardening machinery, so he was able to go to the best schools. He was able to travel around the world, so he had a lot of exposure to a world outside of Germany that certain other people didn't have. So, born in 1955, about 10 years after World War II, as the country was starting to rebuild itself. It's also notable that he grew up in West Germany. And if we know what happened to Germany post World War II, if you were in West Germany, you definitely had a lot more opportunity to be exposed to Hollywood films and Hollywood cinema, which he got at a really young age. He saw Star Wars, and for him, he's like, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to make these kind of movies. Although he didn't initially want to be a director, he wanted to go into production design, which, if you watch his movies carefully and you see all of the miniature work, you can sort of see that through line there. But once he got out of his school, that's when he's like, okay, I just want to go directing. And directors, if you're not sure how the hierarchy on a film works, most people know that the director is like the top guy, but the director is the one who oversees everyone, in many cases picks who does what. So, and there are certain directors where they'll always have the same cinematographer. If you're a Martin Scorsese fan, Thelma Schoonmaker has edited pretty much all of his films. You do kind of have to have a little bit of an ego and maybe be a little bit of a control freak to be a director. But it also means you get to kind of run the ship and go, all right, well, if I want this kind of production design, I'm going to find the person that can do that. And you can have a little bit more input in that. And it's interesting to point out where he went, the University of Television and Film in Munich. Wim Wenders, a great director, his most famous film in the United States is probably Paris, Texas, is also an alum of that film, of that school. So talk about two very different polar opposites going to the same school. Oh, also, Perfect Days, which came out very recently, the Japanese film, was directed by Wim Wenders. I would highly recommend it. So he goes to university, gets out, wants to direct. He hits the ground running with his career pretty quickly, and makes a lot of, let's just say, genre movies. I don't know what this keyboard's doing to me. It's trying to sabotage my program. So, unlike his contemporaries, like Wim Wenders, or not a contemporary, but someone who was a big name in German cinema until his death in 1982, Rainer Werner Fassbinder, Emmerich didn't want to do these deep movies. He didn't want to tell, well, he wanted to tell human stories, but a director like Fassbinder and a director like Wenders, their films are quiet, they're contemplative. You're basically watching a story unfold very quietly, or I don't know, not always in Fassbinder's films. Um, but they're the art house type of movies. Whereas Emmerich wanted to go more towards spectacle. Again, this is the guy who watched Star Wars. He watched stuff like Jaws. He later saw films like The Towering Inferno, which we'll get into. He wanted to make those movies. And again, there is room for everything. It can never be just one thing. Like I love Wim Wenders' work. I also love Independence Day, and I've probably watched Independence Day more than I've watched Wings of Desire. So the four movies he made in Germany were The Noah's Ark Principle, which is a sci-fi film. A little similar to one of his films in the future, a science fiction, a film called Joey, which is a horror film. A movie called Hollywood Monster, also known as Ghost Chase, which was a horror comedy, and Moon 44, which is another science fiction film. Notably for Moon 44 is where he meets his future collaborator, screenwriter Dean Devlin. Devlin actually started out wanting to act, and where could you get a role pretty cheap but still get work? Sometimes go overseas. If you remember the film Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Leonardo DiCaprio's character's like, where can I reinvent myself? I'll go to Italy where they're making spaghetti westerns. Well, a lot of actors, if they're like, I'm looking to break in, they would either go into horror movies or they would go into overseas movies. I mean, everyone's got to eat. But Emmerich never quite felt at home in the German film industry because, again, 1980s, it was really more geared towards sort of the contemplative art house crowd. So this is a quote from an interview with him where he says, quote, I always like to say I was driven out of Germany by the critics. At the very beginning of my career, I got very good reviews. I did 4 films in Germany. My last two, 87's Ghost Chase and 90's Moon 44, got scathing reviews. They were too American for them, and I shot them in English. Then I came back with Independence Day, and they couldn't say what they had been saying. They used to be like, oh, this guy wants to make American movies, but he's not good enough, and that's why he's still in Germany. And again, that quote is very telling because it's basically says like why he didn't fit in. The movies he made, and the movies he was really raised on as a child were ultimately American. And he didn't really fit in for what the German film industry wanted at the time. But luckily, someone else saw his German films and said, this guy would fit right in Hollywood. And yes, this is supposed to be said the same way Will Smith says, Welcome to Earth. So the producer named Mario Kasser, dang it, I found the one spelling error. Geez, all right, just ignore that. He saw Moon 44 and is like, you know what? I think you'd be a good fit for the science fiction film we're trying to get off the ground. It was called Isobar. So that film never gets made. It's not even a lost film. It's just one of those movies that was in development hell for a while. They could never get the funding, never get stars, never get everything together. It just fell through the cracks. But he was able to get him to direct a Jean-Claude Van Damme film called Universal Soldier, which is a pretty, let's say a well-regarded piece of cheese. So he gets a $23 million budget. And again, keep in mind, this is 1990s money. Now a $20 million movie is even considered an even lower budget movie than it was now. And it makes almost $100 million. And the way it is usually worked in Hollywood, and as it works in all film industries, if you're able to make a really good profit margin on a movie, you're going to get other work, especially if you're easy to work with, which Emmerich has always been reputationally easy to work with producers, easy to work with studios. He has his vision, but he also doesn't step on toes. So he immediately gets Stargate, which is a movie that is very, if you're familiar with the show Ancient Aliens, it's very Ancient Aliens. And if you're not familiar with Ancient Aliens, Todd, do you want to explain what Ancient Aliens is?
So, Ancient Aliens in a nutshell, as the title suggests, it kind of goes off the idea that a lot of ancient civilizations were themselves given a little push along by aliens. You might actually recognize this also if you saw the Ridley Scott movie Prometheus. It kind of used a similar jumping off point.
Yeah. It's let's just say for a lot of archaeologists and historians and anthropologists, it is not a popular theory. Number one, there's no evidence for it. Number two, people rightfully point out they're like a lot of these early civilizations, you seem to basically just have this idea of, oh, they could possibly have figured that out on themselves. It's like, man, no, they could. But putting that aside, Stargate is a super fun movie. Stargate's great. You've got Kurt Russell, you've got James Spader. It's a really just really good ensemble cast. And
Also,
hey, spawned a pretty fun TV show.
I have to give it the shout out. If you grew up in the 90s, you heard that score all over movie trailers.
Yeah, it was the score that you heard until Dragonheart became the score that you heard. But once again, he makes a big profit on this. The budget, $55 million, which was almost considered kind of risky at the time. They're like, this guy had 4 German movies and he had one decent hit with Universal Soldier. I don't know how this is going to work, but aliens and stuff were pretty big in the 90s. There's a good podcast called Unclear and Present Danger where they kind of talked about that after the Cold War ended, we were looking for enemies. And after we'd gone through stuff like the IRA and realized that didn't work, we just switched to aliens and comets. And I mean, hey, it proved well at the box office. And it got an October release date, which October is not the film release dead zone that, let's say, a January, February is, or used to be seen as. But it's also one where it's like, ooh, a science fiction film in October. I don't know how that's going to do. It ends up making almost $200 million and at the time had a record for the biggest opening weekend in October. And this was a movie that wasn't really based on a pre-existing IP. It didn't have, I mean, Kurt Russell and James Spader were well-known actors, but Kurt Russell's he's never been like a Tom Cruise level star. I mean, I'd watch him over Tom Cruise, but this 90s were still the age of the movie star. And Kurt Russell has always been someone who kind of eschewed that label. So the fact that this ended up making that much money and being this much of a hit was amazing. Wrote him a blank check. And again, it also, as what happened with a lot of TV shows, a lot of hit movies back in the 90s, it then just became a TV show that ran forever to the point where you kind of forgot about it. But with the success of Universal Soldier and then Stargate, I almost said Farscape, which some nerd is going to get angry at me. He then gets pretty much the biggest opportunity of his life to make the ultimate 4th of July movie and the one of the best alien movies ever made with Independence Day. Now, before I press play, this played at the Super Bowl in early 1996. I didn't pay attention to the Super Bowl that much, other than my parents said, oh, the commercials are funny. So 9, almost 10-year-old me is watching this, and this trailer comes on.
July 2nd, they arrive. July 3rd, they attacked. July 4th is Independence Day. Coming this summer.
Man, when I tell you 9, almost 10-year-old me saw that trailer and is immediately like, I need to go see this. When does this come out? I was obsessed with this movie. I think I had my I definitely, I don't know if it was opening night. I had my mom take me opening weekend. My poor mother, so many things she took me to. But that shot of the White House being decimated, that was the selling point of that movie. And people saw that, they were just like, wait, that happened? Oh my God, I need to see this movie. Not to mention, the effects look great. It's a really good trailer, what doesn't quite tell you everything, but it, piques your interest a bit. And again, I think a lot of people at the time were like, blowing up the White House? Are we even allowed to do that? And actually, yes, you can. You can find it online on YouTube. If you ever want to see any behind the scenes stuff, there is a great behind the scenes video of building the miniature White House that they blow up for that spot. But yeah, Independence Day came out and it was the movie of 1996. It was the highest grossing film of that year. It was the movie of the summer. Pretty much everything else that came out that year wasn't quite just, left in its wake. But similar to Jurassic Park in 1993, this was the movie of the season. You couldn't get away from it, and everyone was talking about it. I watch this movie at least once a year on July 4th. I have to. It's almost the only movie you watch on July 4th at this point. Maybe Jaws, or maybe another movie we'll get to, but it's released on July 3rd. So number one, perfect timing. This movie had, and again, keep in mind 1990s adjust for inflation, but this had a budget of $75 million. And go back and watch this movie and see how good everything looks. And I think one of the reasons is because, yes, there is CGI in this movie, but Independence Day and Emmerich saw CGI as a tool to help smooth things out, not just make the whole movie with CGI. This film has so many miniature shots, it holds the record still for the most amount of miniatures moved in a film. And what this movie was inspired by was not only just this idea of, hey, aliens attack America or the world, and also we have the budget and technology now to do a really good alien invasion film, not just something smaller scale. But he's also inspired by earlier disaster films. So if you're familiar with movies like The Towering Inferno, Earthquake, the Irwin Allen films, that was a big inspiration for Independence Day. So if you watch a movie like War of the Worlds and the B movies of the 1950s, and you then watch stuff like Towering Inferno and Earthquake, you kind of see, oh, Independence Day is these two type of films mashed together. And somehow it works. Yes, it's corny. Yes, it's cheesy. But there is an amount of sincerity and earnestness to this movie that you don't see in a lot of films anymore. It's Todd, we were watching this on July 4th, and I was like, this is a movie that seems devoid of cynicism. Like everything is played perfectly straight, and that's kind of why it works.
It's what people have kind of talked about in recent years. I know the biggest thing people compare it to is like some of the stuff with the MCU where there is almost this the cast members winking at the audience like they're in on the joke, and you don't really get that out of this movie or really any of Emmerich's stuff.
Yeah, for better and worse. Also another thing that Emmerich like really took a chance on was Will Smith, and of course the idea of Will Smith not being a huge star doesn't seems so in the past. But Will Smith at the time, he had been in a couple of movies. He had had Bad Boys, which was a modest hit, and he had had Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. The studios gave him a huge pushback of going, no, Will Smith can't be your other lead. And Emmerich pushed and said, no, he is perfect for what I want. And Emmerich, he had said in interviews, he goes, I'd always imagined this film being Americans from all different types of backgrounds coming together. And he's like, I wanted to have a multiracial cast. I wanted to have people from different types of class backgrounds. Because he's like, that's what America always seemed like to me, was everyone coming together, the big melting pot coming together to fight the aliens. But that paid off because after that, Will Smith's star completely shot up. He had Men in Black, had Wild Wild West. Like, he was inescapable for years after this, which you gotta wonder how many times Emmerich just kind of went around going like, told you, you're welcome, everybody. Although, sadly, there was a sequel made 20 years later, Independence Day Resurgence, and it's terrible. Do not watch it. Pretend it does not exist. That's all I will say on it. The less said, as I said, the less said about it, the better. But we will come back to Independence Day in a bit. But following that, this is probably one of the biggest downgrades I've seen in a while. You make the biggest movie of the summer. You have and you would think a studio would be giving you, again, a blank check to do whatever you want. But as it turns out, Emmerich's Godzilla was kind of forced on him. And Todd, our resident Godzilla expert, would you like to talk a little bit more about this movie?
So there had been a period of time in the 90s where they were trying to make an American Godzilla movie going for again, they first sealed that deal in '92. They'd been through a couple of different directors before Emmerich and Devlin came along. And one of the big things was I can't entirely say they didn't want to do it so much as what they thought a Godzilla movie should be wasn't what everybody else thought a Godzilla movie should be. As they've gone on record saying, Devlin went on record saying, "I told Sony that I would do the films, but on my own terms, with Godzilla as a fast-moving animal out of nature rather than some strange kind of creature." They thought a lot of the classic trappings of Godzilla were, and again, this is kind of funny coming from this team. They thought a lot of trappings of Godzilla were silly or stupid. Like they thought the classic design was not what they wanted. They wanted to do like a faster, more almost like as we've seen in the fish film, is the T-Rex from Jurassic Park. They
Mm-hmm.
didn't want to have the nuclear breath. They just had it so initially they were going to have it as its whole thing was it just blew out a big gust of air until footage of that came out and people were going, "What the heck is this?" And they had to dial that back on really short notice.
Yeah. Yeah, the cracks in this movie show when you watch it, and it's also just a really poorly constructed
Oh,
film. And Todd, you'd mentioned that like Independence Day is a film with a big cast of characters, but it keeps all those plates spinning, and that is not the case with Godzilla.
yeah, so independent of my thoughts on how it plays next to other Godzilla films, the thing I kind of found interesting watching it for the program a couple years back was, as we just pointed out, Independence Day it's an almost circus grade balancing act. You have this big cast, multiple locations. You are spanning first the country and then the whole globe with this thing. And there is very little dead air in that movie. You don't have any moments where you're kind of like, can we fast forward? There's no by comparison, Godzilla has a smaller cast, a smaller location, it should be tighter focused, and yet it is a slog to get through.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say this much, Ed, just leave it at this. I think one of the biggest problems is, and I have nothing against him as an actor, Matthew Broderick and his character do not belong in that movie. He only exists as a plot device, but it's like, I get Jean Reno's story here. I get Maria Patillo and Hank Azaria's stories in here. Broderick is just there to drop plot nuggets.
Yeah, no. And yeah, I think the audience had the same reaction as well. Granted, I was 12 and dumb and thought it was fine, but you know, you don't have great taste when you're a kid. Um, but so this film, much larger budget. There's never been like a completely like solid number I found on Godzilla. I've heard official budget 120, then I've heard reshoots and re-effects stuff got it up to 150. I don't know, so I'm putting that range there. But it only grossed around $350 million. And we were starting to see the ramp up of there's not just one big summer movie anymore. Studios wanted competing summer movies. So we had Armageddon come out, which worldwide was the biggest hit of the summer. And interesting of note, Saving Private Ryan, the Steven Spielberg film, was the highest grossing film in America for the summer of 1998. Armageddon was beaten by an R-rated war film, something that you don't think could really happen today. But after this, Emmerich decides, well, you know, maybe I'm going to make my own R-rated war movie, and then makes one of the most insane films I've ever seen. I'm not kidding. The Patriot is nuts. It's a good kind of nuts, but it's one of those movies that almost veers into camp after a while, and that might be why I enjoy it. But this is big change of pace for what he does. He's like, okay, no more aliens, no more big disasters. I'm going back to Revolutionary War America, in making a revenge war movie starring Mel Gibson. But it's a sleeper hit. It makes $200 million. If this is an R-rated movie that's almost 3 hours long, I mean, this is like, Todd, was Dune R or was Dune PG-13?
That was a PG-13.
Oh, okay.
Looking
And I was,
back, this was also the same summer as Gladiator, so this was kind of a
yeah,
weird summer for like historical picks.
movies used to be made for adults. We used to be a country. It might be as I'm getting older, I'm just like, dang, can't we just have people go watch R-rated movies anymore? But yeah, like look at this R-rated movie. So that does cut out a good amount of people who are an audience for your film. Granted, kids can always sneak into movies. I know I snuck into my fair share of R-rated movies. I even bought tickets for R-rated movies because sometimes the people just didn't care. But makes over $200 million. Not bad. The movie definitely was hit for being historically inaccurate, but I'm like, guys, this is a Roland Emmerich movie. He does not care about being accurate. He cares about being entertaining, and this movie's insanely entertaining. But yeah, like someone there was a review that dubbed it Lethal Musket, and that is absolutely true. Like that whole final battle, Mel Gibson is running around with that Betsy Ross flag, and it is almost comical, but also really endearing. But after that, he decides to go back to the disaster pool for the day after tomorrow. A movie that has actually risen a bit in my own personal feelings on it. I used to be like, this movie's boring and really peters out in the first hour, which it kind of does. But once again, you have the sincerity factor here, and the movie does, and the actors do make you care about the people. So you're still engaged with it, even though you're like, okay, we had the wall of water hitting New York. Now what? We don't have any more disasters and we're running from cold. But this was his big comeback to the disaster film. Like Godzilla was kind of him limping away for a bit, and he's just like, okay, I'm going to make something smaller. And he decides, all right, this time it's not aliens, the weather is coming for you. So for, I think like a lot of people in the early aughts in the 90s, like people were starting to go like, oh, and we need to save the environment, protect the planet. So he decides, okay, for as much as I don't want to do message movies, I've kind of evolved, and I think movies should address global warming, something he still talks about, by the way. So he's like, I'm going to make an action movie about global warming, and maybe that'll get a conversation started. The problem is the book he chooses is the book Becoming Global Superstorm by Art Bell and Whitley Strieber. Do these names sound familiar? Well, if they don't, Art Bell used to host Coast to Coast AM, which is a notorious kind of crank show. And Whitley Strieber wrote the book Communion, which is about a guy who meets aliens. So, let's just say not the best source for a book on global warming.
West of the Rockies, you're barely in this movie.
Yeah, no, it is I still think it's good. It has a lot of good set pieces. You can definitely see some of the miniatures, especially in the New York scenes. But we're also starting to see CGI creep through with the whole final act of them running through the cold. That's all CGI. And it is ridiculous. But as a librarian, I do have to give this movie credit because staying in the library ends up saving your life. Not sure how I feel about the burning book thing, but as one of the characters does point out, hey, we have a whole shelf full of tax law no one's going to use anymore. But yeah, I still think Day After Tomorrow works overall. It is also funny because this movie did get a conversation started, but it was it was definitely one that was covered on Fox News for a few nights. I remember being younger, and one comment from, I forget who it was, sticks out in my head, was there is a character that Emmerich admitted is supposed to be a Dick Cheney XP. But they point out that the guy who plays the president is a dead ringer for George W. Bush, which isn't true because the actor, Perry King, and you can Google this at any time, if he looks like anybody, he actually looks a lot closer to Al Gore. So I'm kind of looking at that and I'm like, all right, I don't know where you're seeing that. Also, sidebar, Perry King in one of the best episodes of the Outer Limits reboot, Birthright. But yeah, it's a movie that's very of its time. If you place it strictly in 2004, where we were just starting to really think about this stuff, it completely makes sense. But if you look at it in 2024 goggles, you're like, oh, this movie's goofy. But just like with the Patriot, goofy can be fun. This is goofy and not fun. We're kind of seeing a pattern here with Emmerich where he has a pretty decent hit or a huge hit, and then the next movie he makes as a follow-up is a complete bomb, and that's 10,000 BC. Once again, he has some interesting inspirations for it. So, Quest for Fire, which is a film about, Todd, was that Neanderthals or just cave people?
I
Like
honestly
cave
can't remember off the top of my
hominids.
head.
I'll
Let me look into that real quick.
Okay. But yeah, Quest for Fire is a very almost experimental film. There's not a lot of English dialogue in it because it's about really early Paleolithic people. So he's inspired by that. And then this book, Fingerprints of the Gods, which also has a little bit of Ancient Aliens vibes to it. He did kind of go, I want a cast of unknowns, similar to what he did with some of Independence Day, where he's like, I don't want this to be packed with big stars. But it doesn't translate to a good movie. I do think it's his worst film. Yeah, even Stonewall's better. I do just want to say, because we're not going to stay on this that long, there is a better version of this movie that we actually have a copy of at the library right now, and it's called Out of Darkness. It was made in 2020, and it's about 6 humans, so hominid humans, not Neanderthals, kind of going on what is now Scotland trying to find a home, and they start to be stalked by something. It is a much better version of this type of movie than 10,000 BC. And now we're getting to 2012, which is one of the dumbest movies I've ever seen, but I love it so much.
Just to follow up, yeah, Quest for Fire looks like it was a couple of different types. So like cavemen, Neanderthals, that cross section.
Oh yeah, because we did, humans and Neanderthals did meet. But 2012 is a very stupid movie. 2012 is also a very sincere movie, but this is Roland Emmerich. He's not even trying for the human emotion anymore. It's just kerboom, kersmash, the motion picture. But it still, for the most part, works. It's his most expensive movie to date at $200 million. Doesn't make a ton of money in the United States, but globally, and again, by the late aughts, the global market is becoming a bigger and bigger force in cinema, and a bigger determinator in terms of what gets sequels, what's considered a hit. So a movie can make not a lot of money in the United States, but if it makes a ton of money overseas, suddenly it gets a sequel, even if you're like, wait, who watched this? 2012 is one of those movies, although there was no sequel. It was a huge hit in China. And an interesting note about this film, so if you're familiar with the Chinese film industry, it only will import and show a select number of films from the United States or even other countries per year. And that's even changing now because they're making a lot more in-house movies in their own country. But they censor a lot of films to the point where there are a lot of movies that are made where a plot point or certain characters or things could be very easily removed by Chinese censors. 2012 was novel because at the time, in 2009, it was one of the few American films that was shown with no censorship whatsoever. Because if you have seen this film, there are China is one of the heroes of the movie. They're the ones who build the arcs, and there's actually lines in here where people are like, oh man, leave it to the Chinese to do this in such a short amount of time. This film even features Tibetan people, noticeably being treated very well by the government, and there's no stress or strife whatsoever between the two. So very interesting little factoid about this film. And I love this quote from Roger Ebert about this movie. Because this movie was panned by a lot of critics. They did say it's stupid. I do think it falters in the third act because, frankly, I don't care about John Cusack's family that much. I was far more interested in the Chiwetel Ejiofor, Oliver Platt stuff going on. But Roger Ebert says, 2012 delivers what it promises, and since no sentient being will buy a ticket expecting anything else, it will be, for its audiences, one of the most satisfactory films of the year. And that's right. You know what I bought a ticket for? To see Yellowstone blow up and California fall into the ocean. You know what I got? I got that. And honestly, it looks good still. It's definitely more CGI based, but it doesn't age as poorly as some other CGI films at the time. Also, if you're a fan of Bill Hicks, the California falling into the ocean is one of his bits from one of his albums, and I chuckle every time I think about it. So continuing on, the Roland Emmerich makes a huge hit and then makes a smaller movie or something that doesn't do as well. We have Anonymous. And this is the Shakespeare conspiracy. So if you're not familiar with this conspiracy, there are people that don't believe that William Shakespeare wrote his own work, that it was a pen name. So this is called the Oxfordian theory, and they believe that Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, actually wrote all of Shakespeare's work and wrote it under a pen name. And so this film says, okay, what if that was real? Although I've read a couple of interviews with Emmerich, this is something where he feels there might be something to it. So I asked my coworker Octavia, an English major, very well versed in the classics. I asked her what she thought about the Oxfordian theory and if there's any weight to it. She just gave me a look, which I took as a no. And most actual scholars don't think there's much to it. And yeah, this movie, I will give it that it's well cast. It's pretty well acted. It's well shot, but I don't know if it comes together to be a completely good movie. It's still watchable. I'll give it that, but it was not well received, and it might be, other than Stonewall, his lowest grossing film. So we are going to take a sidebar and talk about conspiracies in Roland Emmerich's works, because by now we've looked at a couple of his movies. We're like, ooh, the Ancient Aliens thing, the whole 2012, like 2012, that was the Mayan prophecy of doom. He took stuff from Art Bell and Whitney Strieber, who are definitely very conspiracy minded, definitely, especially Art Bell. Or if you watched Independence Day, there was the whole like, oh, they're keeping aliens at Area 51, which there have been people who've been saying that pretty much since Roswell. And then there's other films like Moonfall, which had the moon is a hollow structure. I didn't even know that was a thing. I've heard of Hollow Earth, not Hollow Moon. So you look at this and you're like, okay, is Roland Emmerich like a huge conspiracy guy? And so he's talked about that in interviews, and he's like, not really. He's interested in conspiracy theories. He thinks they're, but he sees them more as inspirations for his work, and he sees it as, okay, what if this was real rather than truth? Well, with the exception of the Oxfordian theory. So he would look, so for something like he talked about Moonfall, and he goes, someone gave me a book about the Earth being the moon being hollow, and he goes, well, that's absurd, but also, hey, this is an interesting idea for a film. What if this was true, and what if it threatened the planet? So that's kind of how he approaches a lot of these things. But in the past couple of years, so this is from a Vanity Fair piece, he talked about how conspiracies aren't fun anymore. And he said, quote, I think I'll leave them for now, the conspiracy theories. Moonfall is maybe my last movie ever that is a conspiracy theory. It got super dangerous. All of a sudden, people believe in the flat earth theory. They believe QAnon, where they say Democrats live off the blood of babies. I mean, how crazy can that be? And that is why I can say I'm out of the conspiracy business, because it's just not very cool anymore. And there is, I think, a lot of grain of truth to that. Granted, in a lot of conspiracy theories, if you dig deep enough, there's usually something very unsavory there, usually anti-Semitism. I mean, actually, QAnon itself is just blood libel, essentially. But in the 1990s, we had stuff like the X-Files, but the conspiracy stuff was still a little bit more fun. It was fantasy. It kind of began and ended with aliens and a government conspiracy. There wasn't the more sinister or even bloodthirsty angle to it that where it is now. So it's like, dang, we can't even have fun alien conspiracies anymore. Thanks, everybody. So yeah, real life ruined Roland Emmerich's creative fodder. So 2013, back to his films, we get White House Down, which I think is a really underrated movie. I think people should go watch White House Down. It's kind of recycled from Independence Day. You know, Jeff Goldblum, the cable repairman, who's the only guy who ends up knowing the secret of the aliens and save the president. This time, Channing Tatum is a veteran who ends up being the only man to save the president when the White House is attacked. Oh, and saves the daughter he's estranged from. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of good action. It's lower scale action from 2012, but it's still a ton of fun. Sad thing was a similar film, Olympus Has Fallen, came out a few months beforehand, and that movie had already done pretty well, mainly because it had a lower budget. But this movie came out, and everyone kind of felt like, oh, well, didn't we just have a movie where the White House was attacked? It's actually kind of similar, going back to Independence Day, where Independence Day comes out in July, and Tim Burton's Mars Attacks comes out in the fall. And everyone just looks at Mars Attacks like, is this just copying this movie? Even though they're two very different films. So Olympus Has Fallen, definitely more self-serious. White House Down, definitely more fun. So then we get to probably Roland Emmerich's second worst movie, which is Stonewall. So Roland Emmerich is a gay man. Never made that much of a big deal about it. Although I've gone back and seen some press from Independence Day, and he'll just casually mention having a partner, and it's just like, wow, this was 1990s, and no one really made a big deal about that, huh? But if you know the history of Hollywood, gay people have been making movies since forever. But he wanted to make a movie about the Stonewall riots. If you're not familiar with Stonewall riots, I mean, June is Pride Month, and one of the reasons it became Pride Month was the Stonewall Uprising was a big part of that in 1969. And you might be kind of like, what's a German guy doing making a movie about an American event? But he's lived in the United States for most of his life at this point, and even if you're not, if you weren't in the country at the time or alive at the time, you can still look at numerous historical events and take inspiration for that. And he wanted to make a movie about Stonewall, so people gave him a shot, and then the trailer came out from that movie, and the plot of Stonewall is essentially a white boy from the Midwest coming to New York and meeting people at Stonewall, which, like, that's all well and good. What the trailer does is it's then the kid is the one who throws the first brick at Stonewall, which, if you are familiar with the story of Stonewall, Stonewall was a place where a lot of people would come to gather. But there were a lot of people of color. There were a lot of trans people of color. Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera were transgender women of color. They're often credited as being the ones who led the protest. In some cases, the one who threw the first brick. There's also Stormy de Laverne, who she was credited, she was a Black lesbian, credited as being someone who called for resistance to the police and the raids. So it's a very ahistorical film. And now, granted, we can all talk about, like, we talked about with The Patriot. We're not going to watch a history film. We're going to watch Mel Gibson, stab some British soldiers. But when the history is a little bit closer, when there are people who went through this who are still alive, it's a little more raw for people, and that's where a lot of the controversy came up. So you think Day After Tomorrow would be his most controversial film? It turns out it was this. This movie's just not very good. It's really not, and it's interesting to watch this and compare it to Gus Van Sant's film about Harvey Milk, which did a really good job of showing what a coalition and a community that Harvey had around him. This movie doesn't really do that. So yeah, it's a dropped brick of a movie. And then between this, we do have Independence Day Resurgence, which that is a movie where it bombed completely. And arguably that is Emmerich's first bomb. He had movies that underperformed. Independence Day Resurgence bombed, mainly because there were a lot of people who were like, who is asking for this? So underperforms. So between White House Down underperforming, Stonewall being a lightning rod for controversy and not getting a wide release, so not making a ton of money, and then Independence Day Resurgence bombing, Emmerich just is having trouble getting people to finance his films. So he then starts to have to get independent and self-finance films. So for Midway, which came out in 2019, he went to Chinese investors, some German investors. He even put his own money into that. And it's one of the most expensive independent movies ever made, but it only makes $127 million on a $100 million budget. And while that's not bad, whenever you see budgets in movies, that's only the production budget. Distribution is not being factored into that. Advertising and marketing is not being factored into that. So most movies, when you see them, you almost want to, at the very least, add half of the production budget onto it and go, okay, did this movie really break even? So Midway comes out, doesn't really make much of a splash, and he actually initially wanted this to be $125 million. He had to cut $25 million from the budget. Doesn't make a lot. And then 2022 comes back with Moonfall, which should be a movie completely up my alley because it's about the moon crashing into planet Earth. The moon, so in this movie, the moon's a hollow structure that was built by aliens millennia ago. This movie's very stupid. It's also very fun, but you can see the budget constraints in that movie. And Todd, you and I saw this together.
Yep.
Yeah, it's one where it's fun, but you can still see some of the miniature stuff in certain scenes, but You see a lot more CGI, and
I felt like that was the monkey's paw moment because
yeah,
you could see the miniatures, but you could very explicitly tell they were miniatures and not in a good way.
yeah. So it's definitely one of those like, man, I don't want to call it a capstone in his career, but it's a for making one of the biggest movies in the past 30 years and one of the most successful blockbusters. To this, it's definitely depressing. And yeah, Neil deGrasse Tyson, noted nitpicker of science fiction films, said it breaks more laws of physics per minute than any other movie. Um, I mean, it's true, but once again, we're not going to this for scientific accuracy, Neil. It's about the moon being a hollow structure. We know it's not going to be accurate. But like a lot of directors and like many people in Hollywood, Emmerich is able to pivot. So he's pivoting to television. So if you have, I think it's on Peacock, he is one of the executive producers and is directing a few episodes of Those About to Die. He's working with Anthony Hopkins. That's not bad. There is talk of a new Stargate movie. I don't think it has moved past the planning stages. He bought the rights to this book called Maya Lord back in 2018. Has yet to be made. It sounds like it's sort of in the vein of Apocalypto. But it seems like he has left disaster movies behind. And I don't know if that's entirely his fault as much as it is a case of the landscape of Hollywood has changed. Disaster movies aren't really a big thing anymore. And that happened before. So I mentioned before the Irwin Allen films, the stuff like Earthquake, the stuff like The Towering Inferno or Meteor was another one. Those fell out of fashion after a while. I think what was it? Irwin's was it the last feature from them when time ran out?
If
That's a
it wasn't
movie
the last, it was near the end of the run.
near the end of the run. That's a movie that is about, it sounds like it should be exciting. A bunch of residents are at a resort in Hawaii and a volcano explodes. It is one of the most boring films I've ever seen. And just the appetite for audiences, you give them a lot of stuff for a while and out they tire of it. I mean, we're actually seeing superhero and franchise burnout now. From like last year, superhero movies just hit a complete wall with audiences. People did not respond to them. And I think that happens with disaster movies. There might be a resurgence, and if Roland Emmerich is still around, I'm sure he will grab his miniature kits and find some landmark to destroy. But for now, he sees there's not an audience for this. And luckily, as we see in his career, he's not strictly disaster films. He can do other things. But sadly, I don't think anyone else can destroy stuff the way he can. But I don't want to end on a downer note. I want to end on something great, which is talking about why Independence Day rules. I told you we would come back to this. I have no shame in admitting this is one of my favorite movies. It's one of my favorite blockbuster films. It's one of my comfort movies. It's been one of my favorite movies since I was 10 years old. I know it's silly. I know it can be corny, but I love it. I can probably recite this whole film from memory if you really needed me to. So why is it great? And why is it the only movie you should watch on July 4th? Because really, go outside. It's probably a nice day. It has a great cast. I mean, we have Will Smith and Jeff Goldblum. Bill Pullman is, and this is a theme we see in a lot of Emmerich's work, in many cases, really honorable presidents who just want to do the right thing. And Bill Pullman is really emblematic of that. You also have Judd Hirsch is great. Randy Quaid saving the planet, which is amazing. Uh, um, I'm blank. Oh, you have Harry Connick Jr., who I did not know who Harry Connick Jr. was when this movie came out. And years later, I went back after finding out who he was and had some retroactive recognition. And I don't know what his name was, but he's the guy in Donnie Darko and he's the guy in the Gregor Rocky films. Really stacked cast when you watch it. And again, it's one where it shouldn't work, but everyone knows how to play nicely in the sandbox and no one showboats. I remember my dad watched this with me one time and he looked at Robert Loggia's character and he's like, yeah, my dad was in the military. He goes, yeah, I've worked with people like that. There's that. The special effects still hold up. It's also, this won an Academy Award for Best Visual Effects. Todd, what were the other nominees that year? I know Toy
One
Story was
moment, please.
one
Let
of
me pull
them.
this up really quick. Keep talking
Yeah.
while I am pulling up that listing.
Yeah. Well, once again, we're talking about the miniatures, but the monument destruction scene in the first act is still really great. And there's also, the film does tension and panic really well. And this also goes to another thing of note, is the score in this movie is great. The Time's Up bit in the film, that musical sting is so good. And I love that just following that, you get a sense as an audience member of, okay, I don't know what's going to happen, but I know it's probably not good, but I'm also very excited. This film knows how to keep your attention and keep you kind of scared and excited.
Okay.
Oh, go on. Sorry.
So, best visual effects. It was Independence Day, Dragonheart, and Twister.
Well, I mean, yeah, Independence Day wins. Also, was this nominated for score at all?
It was the only nomination it had was best sound.
Okay, what won that year? How did this not win for sound?
So, do you want me to just read off the nominees?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm gonna be disappointed, aren't I?
Probably. So, besides Independence Day, we have Twister,
Okay.
The Rock,
All right.
Evita,
Okay, I can see that.
and The English Patient.
Do not tell me The English Patient won. Once again, the Academy Award does not know about the awards don't know about sound, but okay, well, it should have been nominated for score. Another thing about this movie is, again, you have a good cast, meaning you actually have some care for the characters. It's super quotable. I mean, how many times do you still hear Welcome to Earth, almost 30 years later? Going back to what Roland Emmerich said about how he envisioned Independence Day was people of all backgrounds coming together to fight. I'm like, when we think about America, it's like, isn't this the best vision of us, where we would put everything else aside to defend not only ourselves, but our fellow countrymen and our fellow human? I think it's, underneath all the sci-fi trappings, it's a very optimistic and almost humanistic film. Also, another thing that I did not really catch until I was a lot older, because when I was 10, my mom was just hoping I wouldn't ask any questions, is Vivica A. Fox's character of Jasmine. Usually in action films, if her character is an exotic dancer, usually, if that's what the character is, she is dispatched of, she dies, to make way for a more acceptable and pure love interest. That is not the case in Independence Day. She is someone who is not ashamed of her job. She's also depicted as being a fairly level-headed person. She's not irresponsible. She's a good mother. She's clearly been with Will Smith for a while. She's also heroic. She helps save the First Lady, everybody, and saves other survivors. And she's also, she ends up marrying Will Smith. And I'm like, wow, for a movie in 1996, this is really forward thinking. Again, when you start to see patterns in movies, you start to see outliers, and you're like, huh, good for you, film, some values resonance. And also, to finish this off, if you've seen this movie, we're all so happy when that dog ends up outrunning that fireball and leaping to safety. And that's truly how you can make a successful movie sometimes. Just make sure the dog lives. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to questions. All right. Well, stop sharing. All righty. So does anyone have any questions or just comments about how much they also love Independence Day? Because I'm a one-person Independence Day party. Oh, I saw someone raise their hand. Or did I raise my own hand? Okay. All right, thank you. So does anyone have any questions or comments? All right. Well, with that, I will let I know it's still humid out. I hope everyone is staying cool. And hopefully we will see you next month for So You Want to Get Into Japanese Cinema. I'm actually starting to build that one tomorrow. We're going to talk about Kurosawa and Ozu, as well as some newer directors you should know. And Todd, we're going to find a way to work the film Hausu into this somehow.
That, and as I'm going to point out, so we're actually going to have a couple of Kurosawas in there, but we'll get to that when we get to that.
I mean, Akira Kurosawa could be his own program, really. He probably should be. But I just need to find out how to do that without making the program 2 hours long.
Well, that's also from a Kiyoshi, but...
Alrighty. Well, so if anyone wants to join us next month, it's going to be Japanese Cinema 101. We'll hopefully see you there, and have a good night and a happy belated 4th of July.